My in-laws hijacked my birthday, so I gave them a gift that blew up the whole family, and then The night before my 36th birthday, I was standing barefoot in our kitchen in Richmond, Virginia, methodically spooning cupcake batter into a tray as the sugary scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the room like a warm fog. It had been a long week, and baking something sweet for my coworkers felt like a small act of joy I could still control. Meanwhile, from the living room, the low rumble of basketball commentary and Bryce's occasional outbursts, half cheering, half swearing, blended into the background like the soundtrack of a life I was beginning to question more often than I wanted to admit. Just as I was sliding the first tray into the oven, the landline rang, slicing through the air with that sharp, dated buzz that made it feel like bad news before I even picked up. It was already past 8, and I instinctively wiped my hands on a towel, hesitating before answering. Only a few people ever called our landline anymore, and most of them came with some level of obligation. When I lifted the receiver and heard the artificially sweet drawl of Bryce's mother, Rochelle, I felt my stomach clench in that old, familiar way it always did when I was about to be asked for something I didn't want to give. "Hello, dear," she said in a tone that dripped with the same passive condescension she'd used since the day we met. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." My hand was still sticky with batter, and the timer on the oven hadn't even started counting down yet, but I replied with a polite lie. "Of course not," I said, trying not to sound like I already regretted picking up. Rochelle launched into her pitch with the kind of well-practiced smoothness that told me this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment idea, but something she and her husband Walter had likely discussed for days, maybe weeks. "We've been thinking," she began, "the way people do right before they steamroll over your plans. Walter's retirement party is coming up this weekend, and with your birthday so close, we thought it would be lovely to combine the events. Makes sense, doesn't it?" I blinked, gripping the edge of the counter to ground myself. I'd planned a small dinner with friends, nothing extravagant, but it was supposed to be mine, something just for me, something uncomplicated. Rochelle's words hit like a slap disguised as a compliment. Before I could even respond, Bryce's voice carried over from the couch. "She's right, babe. It's just more practical. Dad's retirement is a big deal." It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, like the decision had already been made, like my birthday had never mattered enough to be defended in the first place. "So let me get this straight," I said, carefully measuring my words. "You're suggesting we cancel my birthday plans and instead throw your dad a retirement party here?" "Not cancel," Rochelle interrupted quickly, the way someone does when they know they're pushing too far but have no intention of backing off. "We're merging them. And since your house is so cozy and perfect for gatherings, we thought it would be the ideal spot." I felt the heat of the oven warming my back, but it couldn't hold a candle to the rising burn in my chest. I wanted to scream, but what came out was a calm, practiced smile in my voice. "Absolutely," I said. "In fact, I've prepared something special for everyone." Rochelle sounded delighted, clearly interpreting my words as surrender, not strategy. "Wonderful," she said. "We'll see you tomorrow evening." I hung up slowly, like the act itself was a decision I hadn't fully made yet. Behind me, Bryce was back to his game, completely oblivious to the emotional backhand I'd just taken on the chin. I stood there in the kitchen, not moving for a full minute, watching the cupcake batter congeal in the bowl, my birthday crumbling like dry cake in my hands. And in that moment, something in me hardened, not with rage, but with clarity. If they were going to treat me like a footnote in my own story, then I was going to give them a chapter they'd never forget. The next morning, I cleaned the house from top to bottom with a level of mechanical focus that only comes from white-hot resentment disguised as hospitality. I scrubbed the baseboards, rearranged furniture, and hung a large celebratory banner that read in thick gold letters, "Congratulations on your retirement, Walter." Beneath it, in faint cursive, barely visible unless you squinted, I added, "And happy birthday, Danielle." It was petty, but it was also perfectly in line with the kind of passive-aggressive performance this family had perfected long before I ever married into it. Bryce didn't say a word about the banner. He just kept asking if we had enough ice and if I remembered to chill the wine Rochelle liked. By 6 that evening, the house was filled with voices that sounded far too loud for such a small space. Rochelle immediately took over the role of hostess, barking orders with a smile, making sure Walter stayed in the center of every photo, and acting like she had planned the whole thing herself. I floated through the evening like a ghost with a tray, refilling drinks, clearing plates, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny. My birthday was never mentioned, not even once. Not by Rochelle, not by Walter, and certainly not by Bryce. I watched them all soak in the spotlight, and it occurred to me that this wasn't just about one night. This had always been the arrangement. They took, and I gave and smiled. But I hadn't forgotten what I said on the phone, that I had prepared something special. As dessert began circulating, and the room settled into that post-meal hum, I tapped my glass with a spoon, the sound cutting through the chatter like a razor. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. I felt every pair of eyes land on me like spotlights on a stage I never asked to be on. Thank you all for coming. I began, keeping my voice steady even as my heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to warn me. Tonight, we're here to honor Walter's incredible career and, coincidentally, celebrate my birthday as well. But I also have one more gift for the people closest to me. I reached into a decorative box and pulled out 3 crisp white envelopes, each sealed in gold wax. I handed one to Rochelle, one to Walter, and one to Bryce. They exchanged quick glances before opening them in unison. Silence fell again. Rochelle's smile faded instantly, replaced by a confused scowl. "What is this?" she asked. Bryce furrowed his brow. "A therapy session?" Walter adjusted his glasses, rereading the invitation with growing discomfort. I nodded, holding my ground. "Yes, a family therapy session next week. I thought it might be time for some honest conversations in a neutral space, where everyone has to actually listen." Rochelle's face turned bright red, her grip on the envelope tightening like it might strangle her. "You're joking." "Not even a little," I said, making sure my eyes didn't waver from hers. "We keep pretending everything's fine, but it's not. And I'm tired of pretending." Bryce muttered something under his breath, but I caught the word embarrassment. I looked at him directly. "You agreed to this party without even asking me. You let your parents decide that my birthday wasn't worth celebrating. And you want to talk about embarrassment?" The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was electric, like the final moment before a storm breaks. I let it hang there, heavy and unyielding, before calmly walking to the kitchen to fetch the cupcakes I had originally baked for my coworkers. 3 days passed without a single word from Rochelle or Walter, which was odd given how vocal they'd been about every trivial thing for the last decade. I thought maybe they'd finally taken the hint or were too embarrassed to speak, but that hope lasted exactly until the voicemail came through. I'd ignored the call as soon as I saw Rochelle's name on the screen, letting it ring until the soft tone of silence gave way to her voice. She sounded as icy as ever, but with a twist of theatrical hurt layered over every word. "This therapy thing is a terrible idea," she began, pausing dramatically like she was expecting applause. "We don't need a stranger telling us how to be a family. George is upset. I'm upset. And frankly, you owe us an apology for humiliating us like that." I listened to it twice. Not because I was confused, but because I couldn't believe the level of self-righteous delusion packed into one message. I didn't call back. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed the kitchen cabinet, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat at the table in complete silence. Bryce came home smelling like cheap beer and fried food, carrying the weight of a conversation I wasn't going to start for him. He hovered in the doorway like a dog expecting to be scolded. "You're really going to ignore my mom's calls now?" he asked, already annoyed. I didn't even look at him. "Yes, I've had enough of pretending this is normal." He didn't respond. He just disappeared into the bedroom like a ghost with no courage. The next morning, everything shifted. I went out just to clear my head, picked up groceries I didn't really need, and on the way home, I stopped by the post office to grab our mail. Among the bills and flyers was a single envelope with no return address, my name typed across the front in neat block letters. I opened it in the car without thinking. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. It was a printed screenshot of a Facebook comment thread from 2 weeks ago, one I'd never seen. Rochelle had posted a picture from their anniversary dinner, all smiles and pearls, captioned with some sentimental nonsense. Someone commented, "Where's Danielle? Doesn't she usually plan these things?" Rochelle's reply chilled me. "Not this year. She's been difficult lately. But Bryce stepped up and took care of everything." Then Walter added, "We're lucky to have a son who puts family first." My hand started shaking so badly, I almost dropped the paper. They'd already planned the party, and Bryce had been in on it. He hadn't just gone along with it after the fact. He'd been part of it from the beginning, while I was baking cupcakes and imagining we were still on the same side. I sat in the car for a long time, not going inside, just staring out the windshield like the answers were going to write themselves across the glass. This wasn't about a party anymore. This wasn't about one night or even one family. It was about patterns, decades of being undermined, erased, talked over, and expected to smile through it. I knew what I had to do. That night, I didn't speak to Bryce. I left the printed Facebook thread on his side of the bed and went to sleep on the couch without saying a word. He didn't follow. The silence between us wasn't loud. It was sharp, cutting, unrelenting. The next morning, he made coffee like nothing had happened, humming a sports jingle under his breath, and I realized something crucial. He wasn't going to bring it up. He was waiting for me to let it go, just like always. That's when I knew this was never going to get better on its own. So I made a decision, not out of spite, but out of survival. I called the Austin Counseling Center and moved the therapy session up by 2 days. I didn't tell anyone. I simply emailed Bryce, Rochelle, and Walter the updated time and hoped they had the decency to show up. The day of the session, I arrived early. The office smelled like lavender and old books, the kind of place meant to make your trauma feel polite. The counselor, Dana, was calm and grounded, with a voice like she'd been talking people off cliffs for 20 years. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Absolutely." 20 minutes later, they walked in. Rochelle's lips were pressed into a tight line like she'd swallowed something bitter. Walter looked tired. Bryce refused to meet my eyes. We sat down on opposite sides of the room like this was a court hearing, not therapy. Dana began with the basics, asking why we were there. Rochelle jumped in before anyone else could speak. "We're here because Danielle seems to think there's a problem with how our family communicates," she said with theatrical annoyance. "We've always supported our son. We assumed she wanted to be part of the family, but lately, she's made that impossible." Bryce nodded slightly, avoiding eye contact, already retreating behind their version of reality. I said nothing. I just handed Dana the printout of the Facebook comments. Dana read it in silence. Then she handed it back to me and turned to Rochelle. "Do you recognize this?" Rochelle blinked hard. "It was just a joke. Social media is not serious. People overreact." I shook my head slowly. "No, that was your real voice, no filter. And Bryce, you told me this party was your parents' idea, but you offered to cover it weeks ago. You didn't even tell me." Bryce shrank in his seat like he wanted to dissolve into the upholstery. I didn't think it mattered. I stared at him. "That's exactly the problem. You never do." Dana let the silence settle for a moment. "Has anything like this happened before?" she asked. That was the moment the dam broke. I told her everything. Every single time I hosted a holiday, and Rochelle took the credit. The birthday dinners where no one even said my name. The holidays where I wasn't allowed to bring a dish because Rochelle didn't trust my cooking. The roast I made that she threw away behind my back. The years of minimizing and smiling through it. Rochelle's eyes blazed with rage. "You're digging up old nonsense just to make yourself the victim," she snapped. Dana's voice remained calm. "It sounds like there's a long-standing pattern of erasure here. This isn't about a single party." Walter finally spoke for the first time. "Maybe we haven't been fair. But dragging us here, setting a trap, this isn't how family works either." I reached into my bag and slid a second envelope across the table to Bryce. "This is a lease. I'm moving into an apartment for a while." His face went pale. "No," he whispered. "Come on. This is too far." I shook my head. "I'm not divorcing you, but I need space. If you want to have a real conversation without your parents speaking through you, you know where to find me." Rochelle stood, ready to storm out. Dana stayed calm. This isn't ridiculous. This is setting a boundary. It may feel uncomfortable, but it's long overdue. I stood, grabbed my bag, and walked out. Bryce didn't follow. No one said a word. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd finally been heard. If not by them, then at least by myself. The first few nights in my new apartment were brutal, not because I missed the house or the man still sleeping in it, but because I had to sit with myself in silence for the first time in years without any distractions or duties to hide behind. I missed things I didn't expect to, like the click of the back door when Bryce came home, the hum of the dishwasher at night, the shape of our bed when it wasn't split down the middle by emotional distance. But most of all, I missed the version of me who still believed that if I kept giving, kept accommodating, kept minimizing my needs, eventually someone would return the favor without me having to ask. Bryce didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't come to the therapy session that followed, either. The email confirmation had been marked seen, but he never replied. Rochelle sent one short message after a week of silence. We hope you're getting the space you need. Let us know when you're ready to talk like adults. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it without responding. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a thinly veiled reprimand for the disruption I had caused by refusing to continue playing the role they'd written for me without my consent. Dana and I kept meeting for individual sessions. It was strange at first, not having anyone to argue with in the room, no tension to push against. Just her calm voice and my slowly unraveling defenses. We didn't just talk about Bryce or his parents. We talked about how many times I'd let things slide to keep the peace. How silence becomes complicity when practiced too often. How I learned early in life that being agreeable was safer than being honest, even if it meant I had to disappear a little more each year. She asked hard questions that stuck with me long after the sessions ended, like thorns beneath the surface of my thoughts. Why did you stay silent so long? When did you first learn that your needs were optional? 3 weeks after I moved out, I went back to the house, not to stay, just to talk. Bryce was on the front porch when I pulled up, sitting with his elbows on his knees like he was waiting for a ghost. He stood when he saw me, unsure whether to smile or apologize. I thought you weren't coming, he said. I shrugged, not ready to offer reassurance. I wasn't sure either, I said. But we need to finish this. We walked inside together. The house felt smaller somehow, like the absence of my presence had made the walls close in around him. There were dishes in the sink, unopened mail on the table, and a general quietness that used to feel comforting but now just felt like neglect. I've been thinking a lot, Bryce said, standing awkwardly near the dining table. About what you said. About how I didn't protect you from them. I should have. A long time ago. I nodded slowly, letting his words hang in the air for a moment before I answered. That's true, I said. But that's not the only problem. His brow furrowed, and I could already see the confusion taking hold. He was prepared to apologize for not standing up to his parents, but not for the deeper betrayal of always expecting me to endure quietly, to absorb the discomfort so he wouldn't have to choose a side. I reached into my bag and pulled out another envelope, this one heavier. I slid it across the table toward him. He opened it slowly, like he already knew what was inside, but was hoping to be wrong. Divorce papers. Not finalized yet, but drafted. His face went pale. You said you weren't divorcing me, he whispered, like the words themselves were too heavy to say aloud. I wasn't, I replied, calm and certain. But then I started living without you, and I realized I felt peace. Real, solid, no walking on eggshells peace. I wasn't constantly anticipating being dismissed or erased or expected to shrink just to make things easier. I didn't leave to punish you. I left to find out if I still needed you. And I don't. He sat down, staring at the papers like they were evidence of a crime he hadn't noticed he was committing. Maybe he still didn't understand what he'd done. Maybe he never would. I didn't explain further. I didn't owe him a breakdown of every small, unspoken wound I'd collected over the years. I just watched as the reality finally started settling into his bones, that he could no longer rely on my silence as proof of my loyalty, that I wouldn't come back just because I always had before. That weekend, I sent out invitations. Real ones. No hidden therapy sessions, no passive-aggressive setups, no pretense. Just a rooftop party downtown with string lights, good music, and people who actually gave a damn about me. The invitation said it all, a celebration of new beginnings. Come as you are. Friends I hadn't heard from in years showed up. Old coworkers brought wine and inside jokes. Neighbors I thought barely noticed me hugged me like I mattered. Even a few relatives came, ones who used to avoid any event hosted by Rochelle just to keep the peace. When I saw Rochelle walk in halfway through, wearing pearls and a stiff navy dress like she was attending a gala, I almost laughed. She paused in the doorway, scanning the room with thinly veiled confusion. I watched her eyes land on the banner strung across the back wall, glowing softly under the string lights. Here's to the woman who finally stopped asking for permission. Her expression froze. She stayed for maybe 10 minutes, long enough to sip half a flute of champagne and confirm that Bryce wasn't there. I hadn't invited him. I didn't even consider it. She left without saying a word, and I smiled, not out of malice, but because it felt like closing a chapter with final punctuation. That night, standing on the rooftop with wind in my hair and laughter echoing around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just freedom, but alignment. I was no longer negotiating with people who refused to see me. I was no longer begging to matter to people who only valued me when I was useful. I didn't just throw a party. I threw away a life that no longer fit me. I chose myself. Finally, the morning after the rooftop party, I woke up wrapped in a blanket that smelled like rose water and burnt sugar, leftovers from someone's spilled drink mixing with the breeze that had drifted in through the cracked window. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The white noise of the street, the muted sounds of footsteps in the hallway, none of it matched the house I used to call home. But then it all came back. The laughter, the dancing, the glow of lights strung across the skyline. And I smiled, not because I was over it, but because I was finally in it, present in a life I wasn't shrinking to survive. Bryce still hadn't responded. I hadn't expected him to. If anything, I imagined he'd been stunned into silence, maybe even furious that I had dared to move on publicly, loudly, without seeking his permission or forgiveness. But this wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't even about Rochelle, who had barely lasted 10 minutes before leaving my party without saying a word. It was about me choosing not to disappear for anyone else again, no matter how polite they made the request. A week passed, then two, and life began to stretch out like a road I hadn't dared walk before. I took long walks in the morning with coffee, sometimes wandering through streets I didn't recognize just to remind myself that the world was still big and open and mine to explore. Then, 3 weeks after the party, something happened that made my breath catch. I received a text from Bryce. No greeting, no apology, just a photo. It was of the living room back at the house. My bookshelves were empty. The banner I'd made for Walter's retirement still hung, drooping and dusty. A single sentence followed. I guess this is what you wanted. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or scream. He still didn't get it. He still thought this was about winning or punishment or performance. I didn't respond. Instead, I deleted the message and went on with my day, choosing peace over explanation. 2 days later, I got a message from a mutual friend, someone who'd once been close to us both. She said she'd seen Bryce out at a bar with a woman he used to work with. Nothing scandalous, just loud laughter and hands that lingered too long on the table. I didn't feel jealous. I didn't even feel surprised. What I felt was a kind of exhaustion, the kind that creeps in when someone confirms exactly what you already knew. I poured a glass of water, sat on my balcony, and stared at the traffic below like it might spell something out for me. I didn't need to react. I'd already left. Whatever he did now wasn't mine to carry. But the universe has a way of twisting the knife just when you start to feel steady again. A week later, my phone buzzed with a message from Rochelle. Just a link. No context, no explanation. It led to an engagement announcement. Bryce and the woman from the bar, smiling beneath a willow tree, her hand resting dramatically on his chest. I blinked hard, stunned not by the engagement itself, but by the speed of it. Barely 3 months since I'd moved out, and he was already declaring himself someone else's forever. I laughed, once, loud and sharp, because the absurdity of it deserved a soundtrack. Rochelle's message came an hour later. Some people don't wait forever to move on. Thought you should know before someone else told you. That night, I opened a new document on my laptop and started writing. Not to them. Not for anyone's eyes but mine. I wrote about the feeling of erasure, about being minimized until I became someone even I didn't recognize. I wrote about how leaving wasn't the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was staying for so long, convincing myself that endurance was love. And when I finished, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply saved the file and closed the laptop, content to let the words live there, locked away from their judgment. A month passed without contact. I assumed things had settled. Then came the phone call from my cousin Mara, whose hobby was online sleuthing and sipping wine while reporting her findings like a tabloid correspondent. "You're not going to believe this," she said, barely getting the words out between laughs. "Bryce's new fiancé? She just posted a rant about emotional neglect and how she's been manipulated by a toxic partner who hides behind his mother's approval. She said she's starting therapy to recover her voice." I blinked. "Already?" Mara cackled. "Already. And guess what? Rochelle liked the post." I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Some stories write themselves, and this one was busy burning from both ends. I wasn't surprised when, 2 weeks later, the engagement was quietly called off. No post, no dramatic farewell, just a sudden disappearance of tagged photos and mutual unfollows. But the part that made me pause, that made me sit down and actually catch my breath, was what came next. Bryce reached out again. Not by text. Not through a friend. He showed up. It was a Saturday. I'd just gotten back from a local market, my arms full of produce and fresh bread, when I found him sitting on the steps of my building. He looked smaller somehow, not in size but in spirit. He stood as I approached, unsure whether to smile or apologize. I didn't say anything, just waited. He finally spoke. I didn't come to argue. I didn't know where else to go. I gestured to a bench nearby. We sat. The silence was thick, but I didn't fill it. He did. "I thought if I moved on fast enough, it wouldn't feel like I lost anything," he said, voice quiet. "But I did. I lost you. And I think I'm only just realizing what that means." I stared ahead, watching a couple walk their dog. "You didn't lose me," I said. "You gave me away, piece by piece. Every time you chose silence over standing up for me." He didn't deny it. Just nodded, eyes glossy. "I miss you," he said. "But I get it now. Why you left. Why you had to." I turned to face him. "That's not enough anymore. Understanding isn't the same as change. And I don't need either from you now." He nodded again, slower this time, like the weight of it was finally sinking in. "So this is goodbye?" I took a deep breath. "It's closure." And with that, he stood, thanked me, and walked away for the last time. I watched until he turned the corner. Then I went inside, placed the bread on the counter, and turned on the kettle. The apartment felt warmer that day, filled not with echoes of the past, but with the sound of a woman who had finally, completely let go. I didn't expect anything else from Bryce after that last conversation, and for the most part, I was right. He disappeared the way people do when they've said everything they can but know it won't fix what's broken beyond repair. What surprised me wasn't the silence, but how peaceful it felt. No dramatic exit, no final begging or last-minute declarations. Just stillness. And in that stillness, I started building something entirely new. I rearranged my apartment furniture to suit my rhythm, not to make room for someone else's comfort. I painted the bathroom a color that would have made Rochelle clutch her pearls, and I started hosting small dinners with people who actually asked me how I was doing, and then waited for the real answer. Dana and I ended therapy not because I'd run out of things to unpack, but because I'd reached a place where I could sit with them without fear or shame. I learned how to listen to myself again, how to hear the quiet voice that used to whisper but had gone hoarse from years of being ignored. I stopped second-guessing every choice, every word, every reaction. When people tried to cross boundaries I hadn't known I was allowed to have before, I stopped apologizing for reinforcing them. And slowly, I became someone I recognized again. Months went by, and then one night, just as the heat was breaking and the first hints of fall were slipping into the evening air, I got a message from someone unexpected. Walter. Not Rochelle. Not Bryce. Just Walter. He kept it short. Said he wanted to talk, just the two of us. No demands, no lectures, no performative guilt. Against my better judgment, or maybe because I wanted to see what would come of it, I agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. When I walked in, he was already seated, his back straighter than I remembered, but his eyes looked softer, less certain. We didn't make small talk. He got right to the point. I know I didn't say anything back then, not when I should have. I let Rochelle steer the ship, and I told myself that silence was the same as support. But I was wrong. I saw what was happening, and I looked away because it was easier than dealing with her anger. You didn't deserve that. I didn't interrupt. I just let him speak. He went on about how watching Bryce spiral after the engagement ended had forced him to look at his own part in everything, how Rochelle still refused to acknowledge anything, and how he didn't expect forgiveness. Just wanted me to know that not everyone in the family was pretending nothing had happened. When he finished, I nodded. Thank you for saying it. I don't need anything from you, but I appreciate that you're owning it now. We didn't hug. We didn't make promises to stay in touch. We just parted with a quiet understanding, and that was enough. On the way home, I realized something. Closure doesn't come from the people who hurt you finally saying sorry. It comes from no longer needing their apology to move forward. I'd been thinking about moving out of the apartment for a while, not because it felt too small, but because I was ready for a space that didn't carry the weight of transition. I wanted somewhere that wasn't defined by what I'd left behind, but by what I was creating. I found a cottage on the edge of a nearby neighborhood, tucked behind tall hedges and thick trees, with a tiny garden that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. It wasn't big, but it felt like possibility. I signed the lease without hesitation. After I moved in, I hosted another gathering, this one quieter but richer in meaning. Just a handful of people who had walked with me through the darkness and stood beside me in the light. We ate too much cheese, drank wine that wasn't fancy but tasted like freedom, and shared stories that made us laugh so hard we cried. There was no banner this time, no statement to be made, but someone raised a toast anyway, and as I lifted my glass, I realized I wasn't celebrating escape. I was honoring arrival. Then, one evening, as I sat in the garden with a cup of tea and a book that I wasn't really reading, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Rochelle. I opened it slowly, expecting vitriol, or worse, veiled manipulation wrapped in flowery words. But instead, it was just one sentence written in shaky ink. You made your point. I read it 3 times, unsure if it was meant as surrender, resentment, or simply the only thing she could bring herself to say. I folded it, placed it in a drawer, and didn't think about it again. I hadn't dated since Bryce, not because I was closed off, but because I was finally whole enough not to chase completion in someone else. But then I met someone who didn't rush me, didn't shrink me, didn't make me feel like I had to earn peace. His name was Victor. We met at a community class on urban gardening, of all places. He wore mismatched socks, talked to plants like they were people, and asked real questions that made you pause before answering. He didn't ask about my past, but when I told him, he didn't flinch, just listened. And that, I realized, was what I'd been missing all along. Not someone to save me, but someone to witness me. It wasn't perfect. I still had days where I caught myself retreating into old patterns, holding my breath when I disagreed, bracing for invisible conflict. But Victor always reminded me, softly, never forcefully, that I didn't have to earn love through silence. That loving someone didn't mean losing yourself to make space for them. We moved slowly. There were no ultimatums, no expectations to merge lives like a project. Just shared time, shared growth, shared joy. And that was enough. Sometimes people ask if I'd ever speak to Bryce again. If I'd forgive Rochelle, if I'd go to another family event should the invitation come. I don't know. And I don't need to. The beauty of healing is that it doesn't require performance. It doesn't demand perfect endings or tidy resolutions. It just needs honesty, boundaries, and the courage to stay true to yourself even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Looking back, I'm not angry anymore. I don't regret the years I spent trying, because they taught me exactly how strong I am. I don't regret the therapy invites, the move out, the rooftop banner. I don't even regret marrying Bryce, because if I hadn't, I might still be sitting at someone else's table, waiting for a sliver of space to claim as mine. Now, I build the table. I choose who gets a seat. I set the tone, the lighting, the rules. And if someone doesn't like it, they're free to leave. I once believed that taking up space made me difficult, that asking for respect made me dramatic, that needing love without conditions made me selfish. I don't believe that anymore. What I believe now is this: peace is not given, it is claimed. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks that only you control. And healing isn't about forgetting the fire. It's about knowing you walked through it and came out carrying the match. And I'm not going back. Not ever.